I'm excited to introduce our panelists this afternoon. We have a very exciting panel on Israelis in the United States. And from my far right, we have Professor Lilach Lev-Ari, who came here from Israel. She teaches at Oranim Academic College of Education, as well as at Haifa University. She's an associate professor. To her left, we have we have Roni Floman, who is the Vice President of Marketing in a Tel Aviv-based startup company, and also a prolific author who I believe has written both fiction and nonfiction works. Yes. Is that correct? Yeah. To her left is Professor Randa Serhan, one of my colleagues at American University, who will give what will be a more unique perspective at this on this panel and at this conference from a Palestinian perspective, and what it was like to grow up and study in the States, and to what extent does your identity play a role in your academic work. And to my immediate right is Professor Pam Nadell here at American University, the chair of the Judaic department, and who will be the discussant. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of go around. Each panelist is going to present her findings. We finally have a panel that's nobody can accuse of being a manel. I
like the first one.
Well, like other panels, I wasn't at the first one, unfortunately. So we're going to start with you. And when a few years ago, I spoke to an Israeli academic who has the fortune of teaching both in the United States and in Israel, and she described the difference as being that here the students learn from her, and in Israel she learns from the students. Students teach her. Israelis tend to be pretty prolific. So I think that today we'd like to learn from each other, and looking forward to your comments.
Okay.
So Professor Lilach Lev-Ari.
Lev-Ari, hi. I'm going to talk about the second generation of Israelis here in the United States, based on a study I conducted among several Israelis, Israeli descendants, a couple of years ago. And this particular presentation was also in partnership with Dr. Nir Cohen from Bar-Ilan University. And I'll start. I named my presentation Between Host Society and Country of Origin, Ethnic Identity and of Second-Generation Israeli Immigrants in the United States, because these are the elements, the sociological elements, which I would like to discuss in concern with my target population, to see what's unique, what characterizes them, what you can find in common with other second-generation immigrants, and I hope you learn something from it. The purpose of this presentation is to focus on ethnic identity and identification among Israeli second-generation migrants in the U.S. And I'm looking to track three components of their ethnic identity and identification. The one that is connected to their homeland, to Israel, the transnational. The other is the diasporic, their connections with their peers who also immigrated from Israel and were either born in the United States or came with their parents until the age of 7. This is second generation migrants, according to my definition. The third possible track of ethnic identity and identification is assimilation among the wider non-Jewish America. And of course, each one, the separation is very artificial. In each and every one of us, there is a mixture of the three dimensions, but in my research, I tried to separate them and to see what's common to them and what's not. First of all, I would like to briefly go through the theoretical considerations and theoretical terms. ethnic identity is more, it is something that we hardly see. It is something that it's inner beliefs, inner attitudes of every one of us regarding her or his ethnic group or cultural group. It is something that connected with a group, not a personal identity. Ethnic identification is the more expressed way which I show my identification with the group. For instance, to wear a cross or to wear a Magen David is one of the manifestation of ethnic identification. As an example, use Hebrew with my parents, with my peers, to learn Hebrew as part is also, and to talk Hebrew in every instant that I have, is also a manifestation of my ethnic identification. The transnational ethnic identity, as I mentioned earlier, is a multidimensional process. We analyze or we see the migrant as encompass several dimensions, several geographical dimensions in his or her ethnic identity and identification. And we also look at the social structures, either political, economic, or cultural, within which the individual works or lives. And in addition, it involves the dual connection to homeland and to country of destination. It could be dual, it could be to 3 countries, but usually, more or less, it's dual, but not necessarily. One possible component of this transnational identity and identification with homeland is the diasporic identity, which the values, social norms, and the narratives of the homeland persist in the country of destination and gives the migrant a sense of being home abroad. And usually it is maintained of relations with origin peers, origin group, familial, economical, or other social connections. Regarding second-generation migrants in the United States and their ethnic identity, unlike first-generation Israeli migrants or migrants, whatever migrants are, second-generation migrants go through a different socialization process than their parents who decided to emigrate as adults. And thus, they experience the new country in a different way. Some second-generation migrants experience inclusion. Some of them experience exclusion. For some second-generation migrants, ethnic boundaries are very clear, very distinct, and for others, they are blurred and dynamic and constantly change. There's another term which is very important to my discussion here, is a segmented assimilation theory. The segmented assimilation explains how immigrants experience and adapt to the mainstream culture in different ways. Different immigrant groups assimilate into different segments of society. For example, traditional mainstream assimilation is the most common and most expected, maybe, a track of second-generation assimilation into the wider host society. Another one is downward mobility, whereby children of migrants, for example, could be, not always, but could be, visible minorities, are discriminated against and pushed, might be pushed, not all of them, to the margins of the host society. And another way of segmented assimilation is the selective acculturation, which enables second generation, if possible, to, on the one hand, to be absorbed into the economic structure of the society and to succeed there, to experience positive upward mobility, and on the other hand, to preserve their cultural norms and attitudes, etc., to their ethnic peers. Regarding previous studies on Israeli, second-generation Israelis, first I want to continue from the previous section that we had this morning. Most first-generation Israelis, even after years in the United States, principally self-identify as Israelis. Many studies proved it. By developing informal communal activities, for instance, sending their children to Israeli youth movements, like Tzofei Sabar, and maintaining transnational ties with Israel, first-generation Israeli parents think they might preserve their children's Israeli Jewish identity. But it seems that second-generation migrants feel at home in the destination country and are more inclined to intermarriage into their proximal host Jewish group and assimilate into the non-Jewish majority compared with their first generation. In my studies, first generation hardly marry non-Jewish people, while their descendants, both in the United States and Europe, about 1/5 of them at least, if not a third, are inclined to. I didn't say that they are already married, but they already have a spouse which is not Jewish. Second-generation Israeli identify equally with their ethnic group and the local non-Jewish population, whereas the parents' identification with Israel or with Israelis in the United States is stronger than their identification with local society. The participants. Interviewees were mostly United States born, 68% of them. The others were born in Israel and arrived in the United States before the age of 8. Their ages are various between 15 and 45. Some, 3 of them are minors, and 13 interviewees were second-generation Israelis from various backgrounds, whereas the others, like 41%, were Sabar participants. I'm mentioning it because the profile of these two groups is a little bit different regarding ethnic identity, not other elements, regarding ethnic identity. So this is a qualitative method. I'm usually used to what Uzi did, graphs and statistics. This time I concentrated on the person, on the personal level, and I think it's very interesting. It gives another dimension to the statistic. I have statistics as well, but in this conference I decided I want to concentrate on the qualitative aspect. Interviewees expressed explicitly positive attitudes towards Israel and its culture, and voiced strong attachment to it, as well as to the United States. So I'm just going to read a little bit because you can read it by yourself. I feel connected to both. I love America. I find it my home. I could never imagine, really, never living there for good. It has been my home. It has been good to me, and I love America. But for me, there was always something in me that I loved about Israel, etc. Many described their parental homes as having decidedly Israel cultural aspects, which besides the use of Hebrew, as I mentioned earlier, including eating Israeli food, the food was mentioned in various interviews on and on, listening to Israeli music, and keeping abreast of current affairs in Israel. Most of the Israelis, at least in my study, were very well informed about Israel, and most of the parents were very involved in what's going on. Much of it comes from parents. Parents in our community pushed their children to youth movements in order to preserve Jewish and Israeli holidays, synagogue, and it's always that thing of, for example, going to Israel in the summer. And then love for Israel keeps resurfacing and as much to preserve it. Unlike diaspora Jews, connection to Judaism for most second-generation Israeli migrants is anchored within their social and cultural connection to Israel. Jewish tradition and practices, like attending services at local synagogues, marking Jewish holidays, are embedded in Israel culture rather than in Jewish religious context, because in Israeli, even if you are not religious, and most of these people are not religious, they are secular, you feel the holidays even if you are not religious. It's in the Israeli culture. You get holidays from school, in Yom Kippur nobody drives, etc. So you feel the atmosphere. So it's part of the culture. While some interviewees like Omri proclaim that it is hard to be Israeli without being Jewish, the majority of our interviewees clearly distinguished between the two, clarifying their positive though inherently discrete attitudes towards the community that symbolizes either. Thus, Yarden, for example, confesses that while he feels connected to Jewish traditions, he finds it difficult to attend services at Jewish American temples because they are not my culture. The vast majority of the interviewees did not hold sensibly negative attitudes towards the host society, the host culture. Almost nobody. But rather expressed strong preference for the cultural traditions of their parents' homeland. These traditions were often described in an overly nostalgic manner, allowed individuals to secure strong social ties with other second-generation Israeli migrants. As you can see in the picture, these are the Sabar members, and they come to Israel to join the army. So they are very patriotic, and their transnational identity becomes an identification by serving in the IDF. Some of our interviewees reported that they or other Israeli migrants they know were unwilling or unable to consume American culture. Jonathan, for example, described what some refer to as an Israeli bubble. In some large American cities, I noticed that the Israelis kind of like to stick together. They'd rather spend their weekends or something like that with Israelis. They have all their restaurants, they have markets, they are Israeli kosher, and the kids, they put them in the public schools. Segi, who enlisted in the IDF after graduating from high school in the United States, admits, in the United States, I found myself trying to hang out with Israelis more and more because I was trying to be more Israeli. Nuri, who considers himself both Israeli and American, similarly claimed, my culture has always been Israeli. We had Israeli food, and I had Israeli friends. Now, the less positive part of the picture. While our interviews refrained from expressing hostility towards Israel, nobody really said anything against Israel openly. Per se, some openly critiqued cultural practices common among other Israeli migrants. Such critiques were instrumental in detaching them from what was something they described as Israeli mentality, which they, of course, did not belong to. It's them, it's not me. For instance, a young Israeli salesperson working at local malls, as they described them as aggressive and distasteful, arguing that they, the vendors, perceive the United States as a place where they can take advantage of other people, which is very harsh, I think. Others spoke more generally about the unrefined Israeli approach, their word, underscoring such famous cultural traits and behavior as informality, loudness, and impoliteness. And the last segment of the ethnic identity and identification, the assimilation in the host society. Those who express tendency towards assimilation often expressed their desire to distance themselves from Israeli culture and other migrants as part of their determination to Americanize. Sharon, for example, I think we are very much assimilated. Maybe because I'm American born and I grew up here. We are very well, again, assimilated into the community, and there are no issues there. I could detect those who were more Israeli and those who are more American by their tendency or willingness to be interviewed in Hebrew. Some of them were very eager to be interviewed in Hebrew. Yeah, I know Hebrew, I can be. So the first questions when I asked them who you are, what do you do, this is a simple question, no problem, they talked in Hebrew. But the first question, the real question was, where do you feel at home? Most of them, even unconsciously, moved to English, most of them. But some of them were very persistent and continued in Hebrew. This is very interesting, the usage of Hebrew, as I said, part of ethnic identity. Daniel told me that some of his friends made deliberate efforts to desert their Israeliness. Labeling them as ex-Israelis, he explained, these are Israelis who live in La La Land. They don't want to be part of it, Israeliness. They want to be Americans. Not them, themselves, the interviewees, others. They tested on other friends they know. It all started from their parents who came to America and wanted to live the American dream, so they really neglected it. I'm coming to conclusions. The vast majority of our interviewees expressed enthusiastic, positive attitudes towards the country of their parents' origin, feeling at home in Israel, supporting it from afar, and in some cases expressing a more or less concrete desire to live there in the future, were common themes among second-generation migrants. This is, of course, has to be tested. After a couple of years, they've been to the army, and someone is going to do it, and he sits here. Still, in most cases, such strong links did not compromise migrants' positive attitudes toward the country of residence, namely the United States. Simultaneous identification with both countries and positive attitudes towards their people and cultures serve as an evidence that a large proportion of second-generation Israelis in the United States may well be qualified as trans-migrants. This is a term that was also mentioned earlier in the first section. This emerging group of second-generation trans-migrants can be called Isra-Americans, has thus far been largely neglected for migration scholars, but see both. Interviewers who reported growing up in households dominated by Israeli culture often expressed strongly positive attitudes and identification with the country of origin and co-migrants. There were few interviewees which their parents left Israel due to push factors, and thus their relation to Israel was negative, openly negative. And they told me that their parents, their father or their mother, didn't feel good in Israel for some reasons, and they dislike Israel. So the parents make a very, very strong impact in the socialization process on their teenagers regarding their ethnic identity. But on the other end, cultural overdose, namely overexposure to the old land and its culture, may backfire and lead some of the second-generation migrants to adopt increasingly hostile attitudes towards their parental homeland. It could happen. Parents' desire to see their children retaining their Israeliness at all costs may sometimes elicit strong resistance from second-generation migrants and accelerate the development of negative sentiments towards the old land, especially during teenage years, which are complicated, as we know, In addition, on the other hand, when the first generation is at least partially socialized in the country of destination, its descendants gravitate more easily towards assimilation due to more intensive use of the English language at home, more diverse social networks, and a generally more host country-oriented environment within and beyond the household. Following the segmented assimilation model, some parents insist on keeping contacts with the country of origin or rely on relatives and the community at large to assure in preservation of their children's transnational ties with the homeland. In our case, it seems that this type of socialization often results in selective acculturation. And finally, ethnic identity and identification are not static. We have to remember that. They are often quite fluid and situational. I've seen people of third generation, which they are not considered migrants anymore, who wants to come to Israel, who wants to experience the Israeli atmosphere, who long to be in Israel in third generation, even though their parents forgot about it. Ethnic identity can fall under the various types of private spheres and in public, namely schools, different social networks, and in the homeland versus the host society. So we have to see the big picture. The results have implications that could be of relevance for migration scholars working in a host or other geocultural environments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lilach. We'll have some questions soon, but for now, let's go straight to Roni. Tell us about your research and your findings and your work on Silicon Valley, Israelis in Silicon Valley.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah. I wrote a book called Sojourners and Settlers. It's in Hebrew. I wrote it in the years 2004, 2006. It's a nonfiction book. It wasn't written as part of academia. It's what you'd call probably qualitative research, but I didn't think of it that way when I did that. And the book is made of 20 interviews I had made of Israelis in the Silicon Valley. I had wanted to include Palestinians at the time, but couldn't get them to speak to me on the record. And I tried to make it something that reflected the community as I understood it at the time. It has 2 Stanford professors, a lot of high tech, but also people that came in to do construction work in the U.S. and kibbutz leavers, et cetera. And it's a book that was intended for the general Israeli audience, not as a scholarly book. But as I started working on it, I found that the scholarly works on Israelis in the U.S. in the early 2000s were very wanting. So I started looking at that myself. A lot of what was written was overly judgmental. For instance, a professor of anthropology from Tel Aviv University described Israeli ethnicity as one-night stand ethnicity, whereas, Shlomo Artzi comes to wherever you are in Israel and you go and dance all night and then you continue on hiding your Israeli identity, which I felt was not related to anything I had known. There was something very condescending in the research, which actually is counter to what Uzi just showed and what was known at the time that I was reading the book. And there was another book written by another professor whose name I wouldn't mention, describing the Israeli diaspora in LA, where the interviewees were classified into unhappy, don't know they're unhappy, and happy migrants, and there was just one happy migrant. And I felt, and it was all about their low socioeconomic status. So on the one hand, I felt that the literature was not representing what I perceived in the Silicon Valley and what I believe is relevant to other Israeli communities in the U.S. and in the non-U.S. And other things that I thought were fascinating and that Lilach had touched a little upon at the time as well was the fact that the status of Israeli wives in the Silicon Valley was the status of what I'd call desperate housewife. They've stopped their careers upon coming to the U.S. and having a well-earning husband, where in Israel you need to have a 2-salary household in the U.S. who did not need that, and suddenly the feminism of Israel just evaporated. And I was part of that community. I worked in that community, and I was not looked upon very favorable as a working woman in that community. That also fascinated me, even more as a representative of what Israel really is than the community. And I'll say one more thing about myself before I describe my view of Israelis in the Silicon Valley. I'm a part of a back and forth movement into the U.S. I spent my childhood in Boston. My parents came to the U.S. to do a fellowship in medicine. After worrying and fussing whether they should go back or not, they went back to Israel. And then I, as an adult, had lived in the U.S. for 8 years. I had 3 children in the U.S., and probably they will have the same problems I had. The only difference is that my kids, being U.S. borns, have a U.S. citizenship, which I did not get because of labor laws in the early 2000s, and therefore that was another reason for my return. And I think this back and forth movement, which I'll explain sociologically in a minute, is very typical of Israelis, this back and forth movement that crosses generation. If you look into where we come from, which is we are, or a lot of us are the children of European Jewish refugees, this back and forth movement for career reasons, for family reasons, has been going on for generations, will probably happen in my children's generation. I'm willing to bet on the fact that one of the 3 won't be living in Israel for an extended period of time, and maybe more. I didn't break the narratives in the book into happy and unhappy, but I did break them into sojourners, so people who have self-identified as not coming to the U.S. for the long term. It's a sociological term, and I'll discuss it. Settlers, so people told me I've come here, I'm here for good. And then people that have decided to return. Usually they all return, so there's no misreporting, and usually I interviewed them while they were packing. And really, in my cohort, probably half of the people I knew in the Silicon Valley returned in 2005, and I returned in 2006. So, and there is this movement. So there are a lot of stories about why Israelis immigrate. Israelis that immigrate, as Uzi had shown, are higher status. They immigrate. The people, the 2 Stanford professors I had, immigrated for a postdoc, et cetera. Lower socioeconomic level Israelis are reported to immigrate because the family members offered them a job. But in the San Francisco Bay Area, the reason you emigrate, or a big reason of it, is the startup nation. Because Israel is the startup nation, what most people forget is that the startups do not sell to a local Israeli market, which is too small and full of technological oddities, by the way, and Hebrew, which doesn't look good on a computer. And therefore, you sell into the U.S. market, and that's how you get U.S.-based funding. And to do that, you have to know something about the U.S. market, and you have to overcome the physical distance from the U.S. market. And then eventually people think, as I had thought at the time, that my career would be better off if I had spent some time in the U.S. So these people coming to the Valley are young immigrants, usually married, with the woman having this prospect of being a desperate housewife. It's not a joke. And some established families with young children. I know people my age that just moved, but usually people that are very well set in their family ways, very well set in their career, and they want to go to the Valley. And they move because the husband has received a job offer in the U.S. Used to be called a shlichut, although it's not. Today, the term in Israel is a relocation. And most Israelis live in several Israeli enclaves. Some of them they're the lower level ones, depending on the neighborhood, and then the more snobbish ones that are more expensive and provide access to better public schools. And there's a community there. We used to do Hanukkah together and Purim together, non-religious, non-synagogue, etc. And what is this culture, and what is this ethnicity, and what are these people doing? What's the story behind what they're doing? And what those people are sojourners. And sojourners is a term which I'll explain. And it also, I think, explained the ethnic and the cultural decisions they make. I don't know if you're familiar with the term. There's a person called Paul Sue. He was a sociologist in the University of Chicago in the 30s, and he wanted to write about the ethnicity of his father, who was a Chinese launderer. So people from China came to the U.S., worked in a Chinese laundry. They hardly ever left it. They didn't really speak English. They had these merchants come up to the Chinese laundry. They spent their money in Chinatown, and they returned. Something like, I read his article, something like going back to Israel and spending everything you've earned on an elaborate bar mitzvah, running out of funds, and then coming back to the U.S., something very odd. They also couldn't get citizenship in the U.S. in the 20s. And he tried to describe what his father was, and the father is not a stranger, or it's not a traveler. He's not an immigrant. He's a sojourner. And a sojourner comes to the host country on a mission, and Sue calls it a job. So my mission was to get really good in high tech, so I'll get a better job in Israel, because I felt my opportunities in Israel weren't as good as I'd hoped they were. The Chinese launderer wants to save money and then do some stuff in China. If I look at my company where I work now, we have somebody who's a product manager. He wants to be a product manager in the U.S. He wants to do marketing in the U.S. He wants to do sales in the U.S. because that's where the tech mecca is. But the thing about the mission is that it's a form of capital you acquire in the host country to then return with into your country of origin. So in your mind, you're not migrating. You actually are coming in to collect something and then to consume it, the capital, the social capital that comes with it in your country of origin. But there's a problem with missions and with jobs. And the thing is that they never are what you thought they were. So if you came in to be a product manager, you want to be a senior product manager in the US, and then you want to move to another startup and you want to be a director of product management. Or you sold your startup for 10 million, you want to sell your startup for 100 million, or your startup died and you don't want to come back to Israel and announce that the mission was aborted, so you'd rather stick around. And at that point you come a long-term sojourner, which is that Israeli that is not committed to staying, but is not committed to coming back as well. And that comes with serious cognitive dissonance, feelings of anxiety. I can self-report that I was very anxious about the question of whether I should stay or I should return. That's why I wrote the book. And there are a lot of issues doing with that, and then a very serious sense of unhappiness that comes with that, usually explained around the fact that I bought these electrical outlets that fit Israeli electrical outlets, but I think that's just an excuse. And there are things that that exemplify what sojourners are. So sojourners assimilate only as much as they need to excel in their mission. So I can be really friendly with the people that I work with, but never bother to be friends with Americans. I admit I am that case. And because I was in the U.S. as a child, it's actually quite a sin because I could pass off as an American. Certainly then. Now with 12 years in Israel, that's wearing off. But so only assimilate as much as you need to excel in your mission. Stick with people from your origin country, and then move back and forth, and also acculturate only to a certain level. So if you meet Israelis, they may live in an Israeli-only social world, but have excellent English, know what's going on, etc., because they need that for work. So at first, being a sojourner feels great, but not deciding what you want to do has serious issues. For instance, you're undecided and your kid decides to go and join the Israeli army because you did not really communicate whether that's a bad idea or a good idea. And some of my interviewees then took their kid to join the Israeli army and then sat in SFO and cried their heart out. I can report this is not quantitative, but it only seems to happen with the first child. So the second and third child do understand what they're expected to do, but was never communicated to them. I met a woman who's a psychologist in the Veterans Hospital in Palo Alto. She had been living in the U.S. since the early 80s. So I met her after 20 years there, and she told me that there was this Indian woman who presented herself at work and said, I've migrated to the U.S., and she told me how horrible. I could never describe myself this way. But she still lives there, I think, Maya. I think Maya knows who she is. There are other reasons for this. I don't think the reason is stigma or shame at leaving the Zionist story behind. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that high-status Israelis that immigrate have a lot of social capital in Israel which they do not want to abandon. They belong to elite groups. They belong to certain social circles. They're known in Israel. People know who they are. And completely abandoning Israel would result in losing that. And remember, they came in for a mission. I came in to do something and then do better in Israel. And there are prices to be paid for sojourners. I think the people that pay the biggest price are the women. If you migrate to the U.S. and you're a woman and you're a second wage earner, it makes sense to do whatever it takes to find a job, even if you're uncomfortable linguistically or socially or culturally. But if your husband says it's for 2 years or 5 years, and then it's only 10 years, then you're 10 years out of a job. And then going back into the job market is difficult. And you see that in numbers. Gold published them, Lilach published them a while ago, and I also have them in my book where women that had high status careers in Israel just stopped having careers at all. I did visit the Valley about a year ago, and it seemed that after 10 or 12 years, women did re-enter the workforce. But they paid a price, I'm sure, in terms of wages and status. It also says something about Israeliness and the status of women in Israel. And then being a sojourner also influences your ethnicity. Because you have not invested in creating a community that supports an Israeli ethnicity because you're not sure if you're going to stay. I met a woman in Palo Alto when I was writing the book. She had a 13-year-old, and she and her neighbors had decided they'll do a bar mitzvah course for the kids. And I asked her, what is that bar mitzvah course? She said, no synagogue, because we're Israeli, we're Ashkenazi, we're secular, we're about negating synagogues. So they had a program where they teach them the songs they had in their youth movement. She actually forced her kid to go to Israeli Boy Scouts because it was in Hebrew and he was not speaking Hebrew. Get him to sing Arik Einstein songs, know where Masada is, kind of recreate their childhood for their kids. And as I was talking to her, she was very dismayed. It didn't go well. And my explanation would be that if you're a sojourner or you live in a sojourner society, you're not investing in any community building, which Jews are very good at. If I were to die in the Silicon Valley when I lived there, I'd probably be buried in the Jewish cemetery because that's what Jews do. They get cemeteries, they get synagogues, they get community building. And the Israelis did not do any of that and negated those synagogues and then created this very weird ethnicity that they themselves complained about the ineffectual ability of them to preserve it. And then, then there's this question of what is second-generation Israeliness, how sustainable is it? I met another person when I was writing the book who went to Taglit, and I think for many Israelis, the thought that they'd immigrate to Israel and what their kids would know about Israel would come from Taglit would be very embarrassing to them. He went to Taglit, and then he joined the army. And then he got injured and had to call his father in Palo Alto and tell him not to worry. And I think, and this is personal, my thought was at the time that if I stay, I would go to a synagogue, although that would require me to assimilate in the culture. I don't know. And I was educated to dislike because I don't think the Israeli identity in the community sense was sustainable. But if I go 10 years faster than, if I fast forward for 10 years, Israeli philanthropists have contributed greatly to a very big JCC in Palo Alto. The Israeli JCC, there's an Israeli closet in the small Palo Alto JCC. When I was living there, now it's a very big building. The Tzofim are there. There's a Hebrew school there that was non-existent when I lived there as well. And I think it may be a sign that the Israeli society has stopped being a sojourner culture, at least in the Silicon Valley, and has decided to take a serious part in the Jewish community, which I think is very interesting. So that's one thing. And then I want to just say one thing about transnationals. When I was writing the book, I was looking at transnationals mostly as a description of people belonging to a group that doesn't see itself in national terms at all. And the question was whether people from the elite intelligent units in the IDF, so 8200, whether they form a part of a transnational group, whether they influence each other's tendency to migrate to the tech mecca, and whether they really, national borders are just so old, and it's just, the membership of this elite technology group, and is that meaningful? And I was reflecting on that while preparing for this talk. And I think it's true, but then it applies just to the husband. The wife and kids do migrate together with this transnational person, if he exists, to the valley, and then they assimilate, and they become sojourner Israelis. And just one piece of advice my book ended with was that being a sojourner for the long term is a problem. So even if you think you're a sojourner, you probably should behave as a settler. And that's probably the advice I'd give for Israeli culture in the U.S. In the long term.
Thank you very much. And finally, I would like to hear from Professor Randa Serhan about your research and your experiences.
All right. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Brenner for the invitation. Not only is it very inclusive, but it's also, I think, a first. It's unprecedented, just like the theme of this conference, which is it's the first of its kind in the United States, and we beat Boston University, which is a great thing. And so it's a little bit different than what you saw in the program in terms of title, and there is a reason for that I'll talk about in a minute. But it is on Palestinian New Yorkers and the state of Israel. Oh, sorry. So Palestinian New Yorkers and the state of Israel, and it really is about the state of Israel. And I'll tell you theoretically how I define these boundaries, okay? So Israel travels with West Bank Palestinians to the United States. And my research, and I'll tell you in a moment again about my field work, but my research found that multiple generations into migration to the United States, so we're talking about American-born Palestinians, that Israel factors into their everyday decision-making, from what they want to do in their careers to how to be upwardly mobile, that New York is a particular context for them, travel back to the West Bank, access to the West Bank. There are all these ways that Palestinian Americans from the West Bank intersect with the state of Israel throughout their lives and across generations. So it really takes a very central position in their lives. And I don't work on Israel. I actually work on Palestinian Americans. And it was interesting for this talk to kind of think about it differently and realize that Israel is so central to their identification and their decision making in ways that I probably wasn't thinking about when I was doing my research or writing my book. And so the paradoxical relationship comes out as American citizens, they feel very empowered against Israel and very disempowered against Israel. So, and I'll talk about that. So let me just tell you background. I started my field work in New York in 2001. I was working on adolescent females, Arab Americans, so not even Palestinians, and then I entered a network that happened to have a lot of Palestinian young women, and I met their families, and that became my study. I did 7 years of a stint with community, and then I came back repeatedly all the way up until a couple of months ago. And so who do I look at? And this is interesting because it goes back to the morning session with demographics, and this is also my limitations of who comes to the United States. And the community that I tapped into was a chain migrant community. What does that mean? Relatives bring each other. But what it also means is generally they're low human capital. They don't have a lot of education. And so they come and they create strong communities. And where the limitation is I try to tap into Palestinian citizens of Israel or Palestinian Israelis, and I thought, just like I did with the Palestinian West Bankers, I'll meet a few and they will open up their networks. But what I realized is I tapped into a few and they gave me their networks and they were tiny. They were clustered. And so one of the things might be a demographic issue. The Palestinian Israelis that come to the United States are they're highly educated. What does that mean? It means that they don't need an enclave necessarily. They don't need a community per se. They're high human capital, and so they don't have the same organization. And the ones that I did meet, they were actually politically active. And so one of them in particular was an activist in BDS, Boycott, Divest, and Sanction movement, and he introduced me to others in the same movement. So I'm not really going to talk about them very much because that is his network, and I don't think it's representative of Palestinian Israelis. So I will talk about Palestinians from the West Bank. All right, so theoretical. I am a sociologist. I love my concepts and I love theory. And so sorry, excuse me, but I have to do a little bit of this. And thank you to Professor Lev-Ari, who already defined what ethnic groups are and ethnic identification. I work with ethnic identification, which means self-identification, which is another reason why I may not have tapped into a lot of Palestinian Israelis, because if they don't identify as Israeli citizens here, I have no way of knowing it. And I also don't include people who don't self-identify as belonging to a group. That's a very different way from the way the state counts people. Demographers count people, but the way we look at it is self-identification. And so theoretically, I use Rogers Brubaker, and what he thinks about is we don't care about the ethnic group. It's not we don't care, but that's too essentialist, which means it's too confined. We think, the Palestinians are this, Israelis are this, and we work in those terms. In those terms, anything that comes up falls back into the explanation is because they're Palestinian, because they're Israeli, because they're Mexican American, whatever it is. And so rather what I look at, and using his work, is that I move towards processes. If there's conflict, if there's interaction, when does it occur? And what happens there? And so I'm less interested in the rigid categorizations. But what's also interesting about that is then I can release the community I look at from saying, well, as Palestinians born in the United States, you categorically have this relationship with the State of Israel, or you categorically feel this way. That's an ideological argument that I don't think is accurate as a sociologist, and I'm not comfortable with in general. So I look at processes, and so the process is, why is Israel central to multiple generations of Palestinians born in the United States? Because they intersect and interact with the State of Israel continuously in their lives, all right? And then one thing within this is that I really want to say is that they're not born with any preconceived, and I know that's hard to believe, preconceived ideas, but really it's experiential. Especially if you're talking about multiple generations of Americans, the state could be abstract, except it isn't, because you have to engage it continuously. And one thing here, the contention, and Rogers Brubaker talks about this, is from policymakers and IR types, and they'll say, well, thanks, you did away with the group, the essential, but what are you doing with this? It's not consequential. Now we're just being theoretical and, and kind of sociological, and you're talking to your own. And what he says is, no, when you take away the solid group, what you start to realize is identities crystallize in moments, right? And actors are institutions, not individuals. And so I look at individuals, not institutions, but how individuals interact with institutions, all right? So, State of Israel as the other. The State of Israel is the ultimate other for the West Bank Palestinians that I look at in New York, metropolitan New York, which means North Jersey as well. But yet, this doesn't happen, as ideologically, or as, it's not predetermined. It's actually, like I say, it's actually very experiential. And so what that affects is, where do I want to work? what do I want to major? Getting to college, you may want to major in something, and you factor in what Israel is to them, what they need to access to the West Bank, what does it mean to be connected to their own families, and what it means to succeed here. And so if we think about them as ethnic communities or immigrant communities over generations, upward mobility is what every immigrant community strives for. And they take into consideration what Israel represents before they take action. Even their national claims, we assume what they have certain national claims. They're not presupposed. They may feel certain things, but what they actually claim is mitigated by what they think is going to be the reaction or what is going to be their relationship long-term vis-a-vis Israel. All right, so even when they look at the United States foreign policy, some of them, yes, they want to make noise and have the U.S. Change some of its policies towards Israel, but a lot of them just say, you know what, we know that the American government isn't going to do anything, so let's not do anything either. So even as American citizens voting and their conception of themselves as Americans is mitigated by this relationship. All right, context matters, absolutely, to them. New York matters. Whether that's true or not is an empirical question, if it's across the nation or if it's just New York, but they really do feel New York in particular is a place that they really have to think about who they are and how American they can be. And so self-censorship is absolutely, they feel, is necessary. They feel, it's not really appropriate or necessary to tell people that you're of Palestinian descent unless you have a lot of time to argue, or unless there might be a social cost to it. It's easier, believe it or not, to say Middle Eastern, Arab, or Muslim, because in the United States we have ready-made responses for how you contend with those. But with Palestinian, it's much harder. Most want to minimize arguments. I said that. Manhattanites, people who were born and raised in Manhattan, feel like they don't have these boundaries with New York Jews either, and yet they say, well, this is who I grew up with. These are my friends. These are my classmates. But when they step outside of those networks, they feel like, wow, I am stigmatized. So the choice to identify or not is one that they think about on a daily basis. One lawyer, and they talk about law quite a bit, but one lawyer in particular says, he's always invited to their Friends of IDF gala, and he always doesn't decline, never said no, but always has some family emergency that he can't go, right? And that's one of those conscious ways of saying, I can't reject because I'm worried about who I am, but I also, don't want to go, don't want to participate. All right, so encounters with Israeli authorities. These are some of sociologically the most fascinating, because it's the moments for me conceptually where their identities as Palestinian and Americans get negated and they have to fight for them. So they get negated by the state, but then they get reaffirmed because they're crystallizing them, right? Because now they're saying, no, I am Palestinian. No, I am American. And it's usually at Israeli borders and checkpoints. And so they talk about, actually they call it an Arab dar, like a gaydar, but an Arab dar, when they get to Ben Gurion Airport and they're put aside and people know that these are the Arabs coming from the United States, regardless of their American passports. And so there, it's a really big question for them, like, how do I identify, how do I react? And the other part of it is where it's another negation is that the U.S. State Department recognizes that their position as Americans isn't complete. Their citizenship is not complete at these borders. And I'm not going to read this to you because it's so detailed, but I'd like to, if I can click on it, just show it to you for a moment. I don't know if anybody's been on the State Department website for Israel and travel warnings. But generally, the travel warnings used to be very simple. I can't get this, hold on. If you are American of Palestinian descent, once you get to Israel, you abide by the laws of Israel, and Israel treats you basically like Palestinians, and go at your own risk. Now they've become extremely detailed. This is all the travel warning, and what's fascinating here is you can go, oh, you can't see it. Oh, sorry. I thought you could see it. It's not mirroring. All right, so I'll keep talking and you'll see this in a moment. So it used to be, Palestinians, Americans of Palestinian descent, but now on the website for the State Department, it actually identifies, according to Israeli law, if you have an Israeli-issued ID, if you were born here, if you are traveling through this border, you may not exit this border. If you've been here this long, you can't do this. Like, it's extremely extensive. That's the state looking at categories and saying, I'm going to refine it because I'm going to change what I think of you as a tourist. And so, because they are tourists, by the way. Most Palestinian Americans that go to the West Bank are tourists. They're not, they don't have any claim to where they're going. It's not going to work? Okay. Yeah.
Rona, do you want to maybe
Move on?
go ahead and?
Yeah.
we're
Okay.
just
So it's
short on
okay.
time,
Yeah.
so-
Let's just go. It's okay. You can go ahead. I don't need to show you this, but you can see it actually is very detailed about each category of Palestinian American and how they can enter or not enter, and what are the reasons that they may be not denied entry. And all of this is a crystallization of I'm American, but actually quite compromised. Checkpoints, roads, and car rentals, same thing. Now there's another degree of separation between Palestinian Americans and their relatives in the West Bank. And here, the American passport does provide some safety as long as it's on your person. If it's not on your person, you're in trouble. And somebody had mentioned Brooklyn earlier. What's interesting is one of the things that came out in my research that was most poignant for a lot of the people I'm studying is Brooklynites at checkpoints. And so some of these folks come from Brooklyn and they go there and it just kind of blows their mind that somebody else from Brooklyn, another American, is standing at a checkpoint and telling them, where is your passport? And so that's, again, another one of those, like, who am I and how does this work? Anyway, so group identity. Older members are simply grateful. So, like, how does this all impact these borders? Older members are grateful for access. Younger members think as Americans, I'm not happy with this. The state sees in categorical terms, like I was saying, but the community actually sees it in individual experiences. It's embodied. And so for them, the borders are, was the soldier nice or not nice? Was the border, custom person nice or a jerk? These are individual level experiences, not categorical experiences. And outside of the individual, the state of Israel is just considered it. And the border control is them, or those people, all right? So here, Israel, I'm going to go through this quickly. Israel mission to the United States is a site of protest, and Israel Day Parade is a site of avoidance. As New Yorkers, again, they feel very cognizant of these spaces, and so if something's going on in Gaza, they're going to go to the Israel mission, and they're going to protest. And what I say about this is it's largely symbolic. It's, yes, you can be loud, yes, you can be, you're critical, but it's symbolic. You're standing outside. It's in a controlled setting. When it comes to Israel Day Parade, they don't go out and protest. They just stay at home, but what they do keep track of is which New York politicians are at the parade and speaking at the parade. And so that's another thing. It's like, I'm not only a compromised American, maybe I'm a compromised New Yorker, unless the same politicians come out and do something favorable for the community to balance it out. Then they're appeased. All right, so BDS. BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanction, we think of as this massive movement or a movement that is growing across university campuses, but it is university campuses. And so the interaction of the community that I studied with BDS is not one that you would think of as they're the forefront of BDS or they're the main participants, because they're constantly thinking about the West Bank, and they're constantly thinking about access to the West Bank or about their Israeli-issued IDs. And so in 2005, I was in New York when they started talking about BDS. And what's fascinating at the time, which I didn't think about it, was that it was Palestinian Israelis who were talking about BDS. When we were having conferences on campus, it was citizens of Israel. And like I said earlier, the people that I tapped into later again were citizens of Israel who were engaged in BDS. West Bankers less so, because it's more threatening to them, but also the older members don't understand it. So one of the activists was complaining that, there was an initiative to ban Sabar hummus, from the shelves, and none of the bodega owners, none of the convenience store owners who are Arab or Palestinian could understand what that meant or why they should do it or engage in it. And so that kind of boycott idea is really still almost an elite idea at this point. It's also a college-based movement. Older folks don't get it. They don't know what it's about. And those young folks who do engage on campus because it's a collective. It's a sense of membership. But outside of campus, it hasn't translated into much. And finally, the Canary Mission is big with BDS. Everybody know what the Canary Mission is? No. Okay, so Canary Mission is it's predominantly a website where you list people who are considered anti-Israel. So anybody who engages in the BDS movement, even if it's signing a petition, usually gets their name placed on this website, on the Canary Mission. This one is another reason why people are worried about engagement, is because on the U.S. State Department website, if you engage in the BDS, you could be turned away at the border, or you can be banned from reentry for 10 years. So that's another major way the state intercepts action and political membership. All right, discussion. And this is actually back to immigration scholarship. Immigrants have long been expected to shed the old world conflict. So if you don't, you're an ultranationalist. If you don't, you're not assimilating your own in your new home. There's something wrong with you. And they say, well, after the first generation, all this goes away. The second generation, just becomes American. But again, these are centralized understandings of what an immigrant is or what a group is. And the reality is, and I think this is the counterpart of maybe what some of this conference is trying to do, how do you keep something alive? And so maybe this is, for Palestinian, New Yorkers, Israel is very much alive in their minds and in their decision-making, maybe in a negative sense, but it's very much so. It's through practice, it's through experience. And so some of the speakers are talking about visiting, for like young Israeli Americans, visiting Israel, engaging in things. Absolutely. If it's not experiential, it can't be ideological. You can tell your kids what you want about where you come from. They don't care unless it's experiential. And so the idea is you can't just think of identity as a fixed thing, but it's something that you have to embody and you have to engage with. So Israel can, as an institutional political actor, can modify its definitions about who is a citizen, even who is considered a full American. Palestinian Americans, again, see Israel as a complex actor, not as a simple actor. It's not an abstraction for them, all right? And neither side can conclusively sever ties. They can't. Palestinian Americans are not one. I wanted to say this. But those who are not from the West Bank, Israel is an abstraction because they have no interactions or intersections with it. Those from the West Bank are very cognizant of Israel because they need to maintain some sort of ties. And, they're experiencing it continuously. What's interesting is the flip side. West Bank villagers, people in the West Bank, experience America because of Israel. And how is that? Is because their dream is to come here. But you can't come here if you upset Israel because then you won't get the visa. Or if you get arrested, you're not going to get a visa, or you're not going to get immigration. And so that relationship always mitigates decision-making amongst West Bank Palestinians. All right? And finally, like I said, Israel is experienced. It's not imagined. Palestinian Americans claim that they have a greater role to play in the conflict as American citizens and taxpayers, and yet they don't do it. And some people say, and Arabs included or Palestinians included say, because we're just disorganized, we don't like each other, we can't sit in one room and get along. Some of the stuff I've heard here about your own communities. But the reality is, no, it's because there's too many differences and too many different experiences in relation to the state of Israel for there to be one unified view, and different experiences in integration into American society. All right, and so I would just say move away from macro level categories and go into the experiences, and we may learn a lot more about all groups, specifically Israelis and Palestinians. Thank you.
Thank you. And I realize we are running out of time, so I'm going to go straight to Professor Nadell for some comments on 3 very fascinating talks.
Thank you. And can you hear me? Is this on? Yeah, good. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stay here. So first of all, I want to welcome all the students from my class, American Jewish History. And actually, my remarks are very much going to be, my reading of these papers was thinking about the course that I've been teaching, which is a course in the American Jewish experience. So first of all, thank you. These were 3 terrific presentations, 2 on Israelis, their offspring, and the maintenance of Israeli identity in America, and then the 3rd on West Bank Palestinian diaspora in New York and its ongoing complicated relationship to Israel. And all 3 could have pointed to American history, but didn't, which I found interesting. So for me, the story of America is the story of its immigrants and the ethnic groups that their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren have sustained in the United States. And when first-generation Israelis, even after years in the U.S., princely self-identify as Israelis, which is what Professor Lev-Ari said, and when Israelis in the Silicon Valley in Roni Floman's study grapple with the question of being Israeli outside of Israel, historians of American history we're just not surprised. I mean, this is nothing surprising. There are parallels in the story of immigrants in the American past. So I'll give you just one from a recent example, which was from actually the New York Times from a week or 2 ago. The novelist Lisa Coe, who was the first in her family to have been born in the U.S., wrote that 20 years ago when she asked her parents, who had been Chinese immigrants who came in the 1960s on student visas, she asked them, "What are you?" And they said, "We're not American, we're Asian." This is after having been in the United States for 3 decades. So it's the exact same thing that I was hearing from you. And she tried to convince them that by then they had actually become Asian Americans, but she couldn't convince them of that. So when the children of Israeli immigrants recall growing up in an Israeli bubble, which I love that word that your respondent used that, eating Israeli foods, speaking Hebrew in the house, and spending free time with other Israeli families, again, as a historian, I sort of go like, okay, so what, right? Waves of previous immigrants to these golden shores, Irish, Germans, Jews, Italians, who came to America in the 19th and 20th centuries, they also lived in bubbles. Alongside others from their countries of origin, and some of those communities, interestingly enough, extended long beyond the immigrant period. So for many 19th century German Jewish immigrants, that bubble lasted for decades. Even at the beginning of the 20th century, some of their German and Hungarian-born rabbis were still preaching in German in their American Reform synagogues. And then they had to teach their children German so the children could understand them. And that's like 40 years after some of them had emigrated. I think some of these diaspora bubbles continue to this day as what were once poor immigrant neighborhoods, and something we've studied in our class, were transformed into ethnic enclaves that became substitute touchstones for the homelands. So I think of New York's Little Italy, I think of San Francisco's Chinatown. I'm not sure Rockville, Maryland's area, dubbed the kibbutz, is going to sustain beyond this generation to become a symbolic replacement for Israel. But these other places have become and remain into the 21st century sites of memory sustained not only by tourism and some lingering ethnic residential settlement, but by the ethnic group's embrace of its old American home, whose foods, historic buildings, and memories link them to the land of their origin. So Israelis are, of course, not the first to create a diaspora around the world. In a book that's gotten a lot of attention in American history, Rebecca Coburn's Jewish Bialystok and its diaspora, this Columbia University historian showed that economic downturns and a violent pogrom drove early 20th century Jews from the Polish city of Bialystok, and they created, as new immigrants in exile in New York, Buenos Aires, Tel Aviv, and Melbourne, a transnational Jewish community. So again, that conversation that we were having about transnationalism. She showed that these Bialystoker diasporas maintained a reciprocal relationship with their hometown until the horrific disruptions of the Holocaust severed their ties to the historic city. But succeeding generations of Bialystokers living in colonies in the U.S. and Argentina and Israel and Australia have forged a unique diaspora still connected by ties to a homeland where virtually none of their current members were ever born. So similarly, the West Bank Palestinian immigrants that you have studied have also formed a new diaspora. And like other immigrant diasporas of the past, it is bonded by ties to family and to nation. But what I found so fascinating in your presentation was how national and international politics intrude into this diaspora. And again, those are issues that I think are familiar to historians of American immigration. So I think of the internment of the Japanese Americans and their children during World War II. It's a super obvious example, but there are others too. So here's a really small one. In 1901, a professor named William Amadeus Graybow, the son of German immigrants, he had become a professor at Columbia University. Was a noted geologist, but during the war, he espoused ardent pro-German sympathies, and he got fired. His position simply became untenable once the U.S. had entered World War I in opposition to the Germans. So international politics conflicted with his second generation's loyalties to his homeland, just like the people that you were talking about. So let me conclude by saying I admired these papers greatly. They've added a new dimension to the Israeli and Palestinian diasporas of American immigration history, but my historian's lens compels me to conclude with a small nod to Ecclesiastes 1:9 that these papers prove that in the history of American immigration, while the homelands may have changed, the conclusions drawn about the most recent diasporas suggest that there is not that much new under the sun. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the historical lens that lent a wonderful, I think, finale to these talks, wrapping them up nicely. So I had a question, but because in the interest of time, I really think that I'd rather give you guys a priority. And my request is keep your questions succinct and maybe introduce yourself, and also identify who you want, who your question is addressed to. I think that would help, and that way all three don't need to answer every question.
Thank you very much. I'm Maya Arad. I'm participating in the writers panel. And my question, everything was so interesting and illuminating. I would like to ask a question about the Israeli bubble, referred to Roni and Lilach. Roni, you visited our Palo Alto JCC about a year ago, and there's one sentence that you said that stuck in my mind, that your parents in the 1970s had more American friends than you did in the early 2000s. So can you say something about the Israeli bubble in terms of, socialization? Is it the language? Is it culture?
Can you hear me? When I wrote the book and I spoke to people who, like myself, had been in the U.S. as children and then returned as adults, we all said that our parents were more likely to be assimilated than we were. And I mentioned that it's very odd because I could pass as an American and my parents certainly could not. They had come from a second world country. They had language issues. They didn't have enough money, etc. I think they came, they're not obsessed about the social capital they had in Israel, and they're wanting to return to it. They just came in and wanted to have the best time they could have in the U.S., and they had a lot of American friends. And I left the U.S. after 8 years with hardly any American friends, although there were very nice Americans that had expressed interest in our companionship while we were living there. And I can't explain it. Maybe Lilach can. It's very shameful, almost.
Definitely. Second generation interviewees hardly have any connections with local Americans. Even second generation, even Israeli born. Most of their closest friends, according to my sample, are other migrants, like not necessarily Israelis, Vietnamese, Chinese. I'm talking about the native born, those who are not considered to be Americans. I don't know, Maya, to whom do you refer as Americans? Pam just mentioned the Americans, the Native Americans, those who.
Israeli-born who immigrate to the U.S. I'm so surprised that even their children are.
the children were not, I explicitly asked them, who are your best friends? This is a main question in questionnaire and also in the interview. And those who said, my best friends are other than other Israelis, are other migrants. Nobody gave me an answer. Among my best friends are English speakers or English ancestors, Americans, Christian Americans.
Where I live, about 90% of the kids are children of immigrants, so that just makes sense in terms of.
I don't know what, but the connection to the locals, the non-Jewish locals, is very problematic. It's also in Europe. I did the same study in Europe, and the same pattern emerges. If you live in France for a couple of decades, even you immigrated from Morocco or Algeria, most of your friends are Jewish, but not local French. I don't know why. It might take several generations, but that's what I found, definitely. And I wanted to answer some of your what's new under the sun.
Very quickly,
I think,
though,
very quick.
Very quickly.
I think that not all immigrant groups in the history of the United States could assimilate in the same pattern that you mentioned. Israelis, yes, because they have some immigrant groups were forced. It's not only a matter of their choices. Sometimes they were forced to maintain to their own niche by the wider society. So I think it's a little bit more complex than say, okay, that's my...
Yeah, the ones that are white.
Yeah, exactly. Didn't want to say that, but
Blank,
yeah.
Okay, we're going to take two more questions. Are there any students that have questions? It would be great to hear from a student. So, Bruce, why don't you collect two questions, and then we'll get the answers before the break.
Okay, thank you. My name is Noam. I'm a PhD student here. I wanted to ask also mostly Roni and Lilach. We both touched on the relations or lack thereof between the Israeli-American community and the Jewish-American community, and that's something I've personally noticed as well.
Stand up, please.
So I've also noticed sort of this lack of relationship or a rift, and I think it's maybe a symptom or a microcosm of the rift between Israeli Jews and American Jews in general. So what do you think are the factors that can affect relation or distance between Israeli Jews and American Jews in the United States?
Okay, and then we'll take one more question, and then you can answer both of them.
I also have a question for Lilach.
And your name?
My name's Noah. I'm a junior here studying Jewish studies. So I grew up in central Jersey, and there was a fairly large Israeli community, at least where I lived. What?
Tenafly? Tenafly? No, never. Tenafly.
Wow.
Never.
Mama, I was near Lakewood, so. But I was wondering, I've also noticed there's a lot of Jews from other Arab countries that have a different kind of immigrant experience, like Syrian Jews and others, but there's still this kind of community among them that includes Israeli Jews, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or research that pertains to that kind of wider Middle Eastern Jewish American community.
Okay, great. If we have time for very, very succinct responses, I know that's a challenge.
Start, I'm afraid of
Okay.
him. Start.
I'll respond to Noah first. I remember reading something by Nathan Urieli when I was writing the book about Israelis coming from non-Ashkenazi backgrounds, where there was a difference in how ethnicity was understood with the first generation, but second generation Israeli immigrants, regardless of whether they were Mizrahi or Ashkenazi, self-identified in a very similar manner. So they had assimilated somewhat their Israeli identity in the second generation. I hope I'm quoting him correctly. I can pull it out from the book later if you're interested. And the first question was the synagogue or Jews and Israelis. Israelis that are not religious are very wary of the synagogue and don't understand the context of American Jewry, which mostly arrived in the U.S. before the Holocaust. So they feel that there's no middle ground that they can talk to. I think if both communities embrace that and have an open dialogue about that instead of one making an assumption about the other, then both can enjoy each other's company. If I would have stayed, this is what I would have done.
I'll combine my answers. Of course, there's a difference. The Israelis are not, I'm sorry. The Israelis are not one solid unit. I do have some, Noah, that's you. I do have some studies which I divided between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim or Sephardim regarding their ethnicity and patterns of assimilation versus segregation. There are differences, and it also answers your question. Secular, from higher socioeconomic status, Ashkenazi, especially men, are more inclined to assimilation among the non-Jewish population, both in the United States and in Europe, since their work usually is in high tech, like Roni mentioned, and stuff like that, or in the universities. So they have more contact with the non-Jewish American society, and sometimes they don't even live in the Israeli neighborhoods or in the Jewish neighborhoods. They don't need them. They don't, like you said, they don't need them. They have their power. So they are more inclined to assimilate, while the Sephardi Jews, Israeli Jews, are a different story. They are more traditionally inclined. I mean, statistically, I found it, and they are less, and thus they are less inclined to assimilate, and they are more favorable of the local Jewish communities. They perceive themselves as more similar to them, while the secular Ashkenazi, they sometimes say that it's another culture. It's another culture, like the non-Jewish American culture is another culture for Israelis. The local Jewish culture is perceived as different as well. And I think the Jewish Americans also perceive the Israelis as different, even though they are Jewish. So there's and the bridge for the connection between the Israelis and the Jewish Americans, if we want these connections to exist, is through the second generation. That's what I believe.
Okay, please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists today for
Thank you.
a wonderful enlightening talk. Thank you. And thank you all for being here. Please stick around.